Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Thursday, second last day. Almost there, although I'm sure you're all buried in work, and I guess I will be as of next week as well, so there's still lots to do, but we're almost there. Uh, if you're in Vancouver today, you'll notice that it's raining out finally, which is merciful. I don't know about you guys, but my apartment's been really, really hot for the last couple of weeks, and so now that it's raining outside, it's actually bearable in here. So, so that's nice. Um, um, what was I gonna say? Um, so we're almost done. So we're gonna finish up classism today. I've got one more video to show you. We'll talk about the video that we watched yesterday right away. And then, of course, your final paper is due for me tomorrow. I wanted to say something really quickly. In the process of kind of, marking things and uploading marks, there might be things I've missed and there might be errors, and I wanted to sort of reassure you that I have a backup for my marks, and so I put stuff into Student Portal, but I mostly put it there for you. I have an Excel spreadsheet on my computer, and that's where I keep track of everything. And so when it comes to final marks, I always make sure I compare the two. Usually what happens is, my spreadsheet will say that you got 72% for a final mark, and Student Portal will say 73 or something like that. And so if that's the case, I leave it at 73. If my spreadsheet says a little bit higher, then I'll go in and I'll override Student Portal and I'll bump it up. So I kind of give you the higher of the two, depending on how, Student Portal and Excel will round things differently and calculate things differently. So I'll do that. And then, of course, if I see a big difference, so if my spreadsheet says you got 80 and Student Portal says you got 60, then I'm gonna look at that, right? Something's wrong. So just so you feel a little more relaxed, I do have a backup. I do have a backup for my marks, and I always check them back and forth to make sure that they agree, to make sure I haven't missed anything. And if I do see a difference, then I investigate and figure out what's going on. Okay, so everything should be okay by the time we get to final marks, but just so you know, I have a backup, and I double check so that nothing weird happens. Yeah, okay, so Monica, good morning to you, Monica. Baha's here, good morning, Baha. Banamir's here, good morning, Banamir. Casey's here, morning, Casey. Karen is here, hello, Karen. Thika's here, good evening, Thika, hello. Erica's here, good evening, Erica. And Ivan's here, hello to you, Ivan. We have a lot of people overseas in class today, and not a lot of people from here. I wonder why. Maybe the rain made people want to sleep in or something, I don't know. Okay, let's dive into this. So let's dive in. Yesterday and then the day before, I think, we were talking about class and classism. And so I said class was a relative social rank. And again, you could wind up in the upper class in a number of ways, right? You could have power in society in a number of ways. Most of the time we're talking about economic power, so having money or having wealth. Although often the other types of power in terms of status or political office or social power, often those kind of go hand in hand with financial wealth, right? So again, we said there are different types of power. Here's Bill Gates, who has financial power, the Dalai Lama, who has social power, and Justin Trudeau, who for the moment has political power. But all of these guys have, some elements of other power as well, right? If you look at Justin Trudeau, he comes from a famous family, so he has a certain amount of kind of social power within Canada, and particularly within Canada's upper class. He does have a little bit of financial power. His family is wealthy, right? He got sent to nice schools and things like that. But at the moment, most of his power comes from his political office, right? As Prime Minister of Canada. I almost said Prime Minister of the United States, but I guess it's still a little early. Yikes. And so classism then is the systematic oppression of people who are not in the dominant group. And so in this case, the dominant group are sort of the upper class people, the rich, the very wealthy, and then sort of the working class and the lower classes are in the minoritized group. And so people in minoritized groups can be denied or can have more difficulty accessing certain opportunities and resources that they need, like money and jobs and education and housing and so on. Here in Canada, or here in Vancouver, that's definitely become the case with housing, right? Housing has become very expensive, and for most, for sort of lower income people, for working class people, and even for middle class people, much of the housing in Vancouver is really out of their price range. And so to be a working class person living in Vancouver, you're going to be denied housing here, right? We said classism was based on a series of ideologies and beliefs. And so this is what allows classism to continue. This is what allows these massive financial inequalities that we were talking about yesterday. That's what allows them to continue. And so the two big ones, I think, there are more, but the two big ones I think are meritocracy and individualism, right? And so meritocracy says that that success is achieved through your own talent and hard work, right? And so people who are very successful, well, they got there because they were talented and they worked hard, right? And if you see someone who's not successful, well, they just have no talent or they're not working hard enough, right? That's what meritocracy tells us, is that success is entirely dependent on you and your own efforts, which again is not entirely true. There are other variables in that equation. And then we have the ideology of individualism, right? The idea that individuals are kind of autonomous beings in society. They are uninfluenced by other things, and they just move around and they can make their own choices and do whatever they want, right? Which again is not true, right? Not all opportunities are open to all people. Not all people are free to make all of the choices they want to make. And so this one is kind of a bit of a myth as well, but they don't feel like myths because often society tries to convince us that they are true. And so much of the economic inequality that you see in society is maintained, is held in place by these kind of ideas. So we see evidence of these kind of ideologies in statements like this. We live in a classless society where anyone can make it. You'll hear that one or a version of that statement quite frequently. But again, it's not true. We don't live, at least in Canada and the US here, we don't live in a society that has clear, hard social class boundaries. I mean, we don't, we don't have a caste system here. We don't have, a nobility or royalty or anything like that. So there's not clear, hard boundaries between social classes, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. sometimes people do, and we'll talk about that a little bit later today, sometimes people do move between economic classes. Sometimes people do come from lower economic classes in society and they do wind up being super, super successful. Sometimes that happens, but it doesn't mean that that possibility is open to everyone. But again, that's the essence of the American dream. America is as much a myth as it is a real country, and that's kind of the interesting thing about America is it's a country and it's a place, but it's also an idea, and part of that idea is that meritocratic idea, right? The idea that, if you just work hard enough and you're talented, you can make it. You can become anything you want in America. And again, there are elements of truth to that statement, but again, it's overly simplistic. That's not exactly the way it is. There are hurdles and obstacles and other variables in the equation of you becoming whatever you want. And so again, this American dream is very much part of American culture. It's very much part of the myth of America. But again, it's not entirely true. And similarly, these kind of rags to riches stories have the same idea, right? So Cinderella, who is, basically enslaved by her stepmother and stepsisters, and yet she becomes a princess by the end, right? This is a story of her sort of transcending her social and economic class. And of course, it's very exciting, but it's not very common, unfortunately. So this kind of American dream or meritocracy thing, again, in the US, only 6% of children born to parents in the lowest economic class will rise to the very top. And why is that? Is it because poor people only have untalented, uneducated, lazy children? Probably not, right? There are other things at play here. There are other factors. And so, if you look at the 10 richest people in the US, all of them are white, all of them are men, almost all of them come from wealthy families, right? So that's not an accident either, right? Those 10 richest guys aren't there because they're the hardest working and smartest people in the country. They're there because, yes, they've worked hard. Yes, they're reasonably intelligent, but they've also had a lot of opportunities that not everyone has. And so again, think about the children of those 10 richest people in the US. Is there any chance that they will wind up in the lowest economic class? Likely not, right? They will remain in the highest economic class because, again, they're going to have opportunities that most of us don't have. They're going to go to really nice schools. They're going to go to Ivy League universities. Their parents are going to give them money to start a business or to start investing. They're never going to leave that upper class because they have opportunities and advantages that most people don't. And so, we'll talk about that a little bit more. I just wanted to throw this in here. Sometimes we want to use binary oppositions, and we want to talk about only two groups, right? We want to talk about the rich or the poor, or the 1% and all of us. But again, the picture is a little more complicated. And so you could probably, in the US and Canada, divide society into these four categories. Some people divide them into more, some people divide society into less. But for us, you could look at, in the US and Canada, you could look at the poor people, okay? So these are people who rely on assistance. So they're on welfare, they're on unemployment insurance, they have some sort of disability pension from the government. Often they don't have jobs. Sometimes they don't have a home to live in, so you might see these people kind of wandering around because they have nowhere to sleep. And minimum wage workers who are living below the poverty line, who don't make enough to feed and clothe and house themselves. Those people are, we would classify those people as the poor people. Working class, and I've used this term today already, but these are people who are basically using their bodies for work, but not so much, well, their minds as well, but often more their bodies. So they have high school education usually. Sometimes they've been taught a trade or some sort of skill, but again, they're not poor, but they are basically living paycheck to paycheck, paying the rent, and sort of trying to keep their head above water, if you will, economically. We have the middle class here, who again are working for their money. Many of them have university degrees or advanced degrees. They often own homes, and often they have enough money to either send their children to university or to assist with sending their children to university. And so there's kind of a difference here. And sometimes the middle class and the working class are referred to as white collar and blue collar jobs. And so once upon a time, the working class were kind of like people who were in overalls, working in the factory or working in the shops. And then white collar people had a business shirt on, and they were working in offices. And so you could kind of think about that distinction too between the middle and the working class. And then finally, the owning class. So these are the rich folks, right? The people who have inherited money from their family. Sometimes they may have a job, but they don't have to because they have a lot of cash. They may have lower incomes, and so they might not make a lot of money every year. But again, because they have a lot of inherited wealth, they don't have to work, but often they have enough social power to kind of get what they want in terms of education or investment money or influencing the government. These are the owning class. I'm just going to jump ahead. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, the idea that wealth distribution in the United States is not quite what people think. There is inequality within really all Western countries, but the US is pretty much the worst in this regard. People are the most unequal in the United States. And yesterday, I think we were talking a little bit about how things got that unequal. How did we gain so much inequality, particularly in the past 30 or 40 years? And so we watched this video, and you told me that there was a few causes of growing economic inequality in US and Canada. And one of them we said was technological change. So automation is replacing many workers, right? So we saw robots in factories, we see self-checkouts at stores, we start to see algorithms doing the sort of office work and paperwork that people would normally do. And so people are being pushed out of jobs by technology, because technology is starting to be able to do some jobs cheaper and more reliably than humans can do. The other thing that's happening is globalization, right? So the world is becoming more economically interconnected, and many of the manufacturing jobs that people in the US and Canada used to do, working in factories, and manufacturing things, a lot of those manufacturing jobs have gone to other countries, right? And so China and Southeast Asia, for the most part, have boomed in terms of manufacturing jobs, and those jobs are not to be found so much in the US and Canada anymore. And so people who would have worked those jobs in the past and made a comfortable working to middle class living have now kind of slid into lower paying, lower skilled jobs. So they've kind of slid down the ladder as those manufacturing jobs have disappeared. I think I meant to have that a little bit later. The third one was the rise of superstars, right? So really big transnational companies are doing business globally. They're doing business worldwide. That means they're making huge amounts of money. And so their executives are making huge amounts of money as a result, right? If your business is if you're only doing business in one country, there's only so much money you can make, and there's only so much money you can pay your executives. But if you're doing business all around the world, there's a lot of money coming in, and some of that money is going to CEOs, and so they are being paid massive amounts of money. We said failing labor was a part of it too. So trade unions, labor unions that used to fight for fair salaries and good working conditions for workers, those unions have disappeared along with the manufacturing jobs. And so many people are now working in a gig economy where they don't have a permanent job. They just pick up contracts to do things here and there. And again, that's very insecure, and it also has no benefits associated with it as well. And so that's making it more difficult for people to survive economically. And finally, there was this seizing the advantage thing. And so this was the ability of the very rich, individual people and companies to pressure the government for things that they want. And so what they want are tax cuts. What they want are fewer taxes on their investments. Sometimes they want, sometimes they're able to use their advantage to get their kids into the best schools. And again, this exacerbates economic inequality. All these things make economic inequality worse, right? And again, they decrease something called social mobility, which I think we've talked about, but just in case, what we're talking about here is the idea that society is stratified. And you've seen this slide before. I think when we were talking about socialization, or when we started talking about Mean Girls, we said that society was stratified. There were levels to society, and some people had more resources and opportunities and advantages, and some had less. And so the idea of social mobility, in a society with high social mobility, people can move between these classes with relative ease, okay? So again, you could be born into a poorer social class, but through education and hard work, you can work your way up, okay? If you live in a society with high social mobility. If you live in a society with low social mobility, then it's very difficult for you to break out. And so kind of the ultimate example of this might be India's caste system from the past. And I know the caste system continues to have an effect in India, but when the caste system was fully in operation, that was a society with no social mobility. If you were born into a particular caste, that was it. That's who you were, and you stayed in that caste, and you married someone from that caste, and that was kind of it, right? Here in the West, we have a little more social mobility. You can move up, but in some countries it's more easy, and in some countries it's less. So yeah, this social mobility is the ability for individuals or families or households to move within the social strata of society. So to move usually up, but sometimes down, through these kind of socioeconomic classes. And we could think of this as one measure of social equality, right? Because people who work hard and have goals and have talent, in theory, should be able to work their way up. right? If we have a meritocratic society. But the less social mobility we have, it means that there are barriers to people moving up, right? So someone can be born into a poor family. They could be very smart, very talented, very hardworking, but for some reason, they just can't escape poverty, or they can't escape their lower economic class. And again, that would be a measure of social inequality, right? And so, of course, the question might be why, right? Why can they not escape poverty? Why can they not move up the social ladder? And that brought us to this TED Talk here, from yesterday with Rutger Bregman. So maybe I'll jump in here and I'll ask you now. Oops. I'll ask you now, because I asked you yesterday, what did Rutger Bregman say was the cause of poverty? What did he say about that? Karen, are you making that up? I don't think he said that. I don't think he said that. Erica says this. Erica says it's a lack of cash. People don't have money. And so at first you might say, well, yeah, of course, Rutger, that's ridiculous. That's of course poverty comes from not having enough money. That's obvious, right? That's what it means. That's the definition. But he has, I thought so. Nice try, Karen. Yeah, he says they don't have enough money. So at first it's kind of like, well, duh. But then how does he explain this? What makes not having enough money, how does that keep you in poverty? How does not having enough money keep you poor? That's okay, Caleb. Yeah. So there's a little more to that, KC. But yeah, you're on the right track here. That's what he was saying, right? There was a psychological study in India where they had people who were farming, and so they farmed the whole year, and then they harvested their crop, they sold it, and then they basically got all of their money for the entire year in one shot, right? So most of us get paid every 2 weeks or every month throughout the year, but these farmers worked all year, they sold their harvest, they got all their money at once, and then that money had to last them for the entire year. And so the authors of the study said that these people are poor for part of the year and very rich for another part of the year. And IQ tests, which may or may not be accurate, but IQ tests suggested that actually these people behaved very differently depending on whether they were rich or poor, right? Whether they had a lot of resources or whether resources were scarce. Yeah, so the fact was, the pattern that they saw, or the thing that they thought they were seeing in this study, was that people make better decisions when they have a lot of money. When they don't have a lot of money, they make poorer decisions. And it's interesting to think about this, right? Because first of all, there's probably an evolutionary component to this, right? Animals who, are starving and don't have enough food to eat, they're going to be more desperate, right? They're going to make their decisions differently in order to survive. But an animal where there's lots of food around, they're going to behave differently. And humans kind of do this too, apparently. So Rutger says that often people who are poor or in poverty, they don't make very good decisions, but it's not entirely their fault. The fault is the context, right? They don't make good decisions because they don't have enough money. I'm going to throw in a couple things here too. Or I'm going to throw in something here just so I don't forget it later, but there's also lots of there's also lots of things that you can probably think of where you need to have money to make money, or you need to have money to save money, right? So you can make money on investments, but you need to have money to invest, right? If you have no money to invest, you can't make any money on investments. You can save a lot of money at Costco, right? If you shop at Costco, you can buy things in bulk, and so you can save a lot of money. But you need a Costco membership, right? Which is $60 or $70 a year. Plus, you need enough money to be able to buy a bunch of things at once, right? So if you can only afford one roll of toilet paper at a time, then there's no way for you to save money by buying the big package of toilet paper, right? Also, you need a way to get all that stuff home. You either need a car, or you need to rent a car, or you need to get a taxi. If you don't have money for any of those things, you can't get all of that stuff from Costco to your home, right? So you can save money at Costco, but you kind of have to have a certain amount of money in order to do that, right? So there's lots of examples of that, of situations where you can either save money or make money, but you have to have more money to begin with. If you don't have any, you can't save it, and you wind up paying more for the things that other people pay less for, okay? Rutger didn't say that, but I wanted to sort of throw it in because I think it's important as well. There's all kinds of money-saving things you can do in society, but in many cases, you actually have to have money in order to do it. And if you don't have any money, you can't take advantage of those things, which is a little ironic, right? So Erica says, yeah, when people don't have money, they become scared and anxious, so they cannot think properly. Yeah, their priorities and their decision-making process changes when you're in a scarcity mindset, when there's not enough time or money or resources to go around. People's thought patterns change, and so sometimes they don't make the best decisions, right? Does anyone notice this in their own lives? This idea that you either you when you don't have enough time or enough money, or when there's not enough of something, that you make different decisions, that you behave differently. I know for me, I used to work a job where I would be paid, right? I'd be paid every 2 weeks, but I also got commission from sales. This was years ago. And so once a year, I would get a lot of money at once. I would get all of my commission at once. And so normally I would be really bad at saving money. So on a day-to-day basis on my paycheck, I'm not very good at saving money. But when I got this huge sum of money, I was very good at saving it. I was very good at taking a little bit and, buying something fun or cool, but then putting the rest of it away or investing it or whatever. So I was much better at making those economic decisions when I had a lot, but when I was just getting paid every 2 weeks, it was much more difficult for me to save or to invest or to be responsible with money. It was much easier for me to be responsible when there was a lot of it. Okay, so very non-committal answers, but kinda, maybe. Do you want to give us a little more, or? Maybe not. If you want to answer those, I'll bring them up, but I'm going to put the next one on the screen here just in case. So Rutger says, I have a solution. I have a suggestion. What does he say? What does he suggest as a possible solution to the situation? What does he think is a way to alleviate poverty? So Karen, in an answer to the last question, Karen says, you are more careful when you have more money and you are shopping. Okay. Yeah, so if you have more money, sometimes you are more careful or more conscious of what you're spending. Sometimes if you don't have a lot of money, you may as well just spend it anyway, right? Because you don't have much. Casey says, this is an answer to this question here. Casey says, change the context in the way that poor people live, right? So if people are making bad decisions based on their economic context, change the context, right? And so he suggests this. He suggests a basic income guarantee, okay? And so I'm just going to switch over here to my slides because I have some slides on this. So the first question, of course, was what's the cause of poverty? And he says it's not a personality defect, right? The poverty isn't a lack of character. People aren't in poverty because they're bad people. Some probably are, but there's bad people everywhere. So it's not a personality defect. And again, I'll point out to you that is an individualistic and meritocratic type of statement, right? If you're poor or if you're unsuccessful or you're living in poverty, there must be something wrong with you and you must not be working very hard. Maybe you're lazy or something like that, right? That's meritocracy and individualism talking. And so again, you told me that those psychological tests make it more difficult for people to make good decisions. There's a scarcity mentality happening. People make different choices when they think resources are scarce. And so people living in a constant state of scarce resources tend to make bad decisions, right? And so again, it's not that there's something wrong with them, it's that they just don't have enough money to make good decisions. And so Rutger Bregman is suggesting this, a basic income guarantee, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as universal basic income, okay, the same thing. And so with universal basic income, they pay all citizens in your country get a guaranteed income. So no one falls below the poverty line. And so it gets deducted off your taxes, or if you aren't making money, then you get money from the government. So it ensures that everyone has a certain amount of money every year to start with, to cover their basic food and clothing and shelter needs, right? And so Rutger Bregman said that they've actually tried this, right? They did a pilot study in the 1970s in Dauphin, Manitoba, right here in Canada. And the results of that seem to show that educational outcomes and hospitalizations and incidences of domestic violence, they went down, right? And what Rutger Bregman is trying to explain here is that poverty is expensive, right? When you have people who are not graduating high school or dropping out, when you have people living on the street, when you have people, winding up in the hospital all the time, when you have incidences of domestic violence or maybe drug abuse connected to poverty, all of those things are really expensive for society, right? If you think about the hospital staff and doctors and nurses and police and judges and welfare benefits that you have to pay out, not to mention the damage to people's mental health living in this way. Poverty is really expensive for all of us. The fact that these people don't have money costs society a huge amount, but it's just hard to see. It's hard to see how it costs us. But Rutger Bregman points out that child poverty in the US costs about $500 billion a year. That's a massive, massive loss. UBI, of course, Rutger Bregman reports, could actually only cost the US $175 billion, which again is a lot of money, but it's only a quarter of the US military budget. So this question, of course, is it worth it? And so maybe that's what I'll ask you. What do you think of a solution like this, about the government basically paying everyone here in Canada, let's say $17,000 a year? Okay, so everyone is guaranteed to make $17,000. Okay, so someone like me, for instance, I wouldn't get anything because I don't. I make more than $17,000 a year, so the government wouldn't send me money. But if for some reason I didn't make enough, if I didn't make 17, the government would start sending me money to top me up, to make sure that I didn't fall below the poverty line. So what do you think of that idea? And again, we kind of saw this. We kind of saw a mini version of this during in Canada during the COVID. During the early part of this sort of COVID pandemic, where everyone was encouraged to stay at home, right? The government was sending out those CERB payments, right? They were sending out payments to students and to businesses, right? They were basically making sure that nobody fell below the poverty line. They were basically giving them a universal basic income for a period of 2 months or something like that, or 3 months. So we almost kind of did it. Right here in Canada, we almost had UBI for a very short period during the pandemic. But what do you think? Do you think this is a good solution or a bad one? Or do you think there's a problem with it? Do you think everybody would think this is a good idea? Or do you think that there's some people who wouldn't think this is a good idea? What's your perspective on this? What's your perspective on this? What do you think? Good idea? Bad idea? People would support it? People would not support it? Too much money? Maybe this conflicts with your values. Maybe you think people shouldn't be just given money for free. Maybe people should have to work for it. What do you think? Yeah, so Casey says it's kind of hard just to give people money for free. Yeah, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but I am saying there's a lot of cultural baggage that gets in the way of a program like this. And this is one of them, right? We have this very deep-seated idea that people should have to work for their money, right? That you can't just give things away for free, that, somehow it is morally wrong or it's undesirable to just give people money and then have them do nothing, right? Because again, most of our societies are based on the idea of, if you want money, you have to go to work, right? If you want to buy groceries, get a job and go to work, right? Most of our societies are organized that way. And so this idea here is going in totally the opposite direction, right? This is saying, you don't have to do anything. We're just going to guarantee you enough money to feed and clothe and house yourself. And we're just going to give it to you. No strings attached, doesn't matter. And so, yeah, there's some cultural uncomfortableness with that, and Casey, what you're saying there is actually, many people would struggle with this UBI, this universal basic income, for exactly that idea, because they're like, you can't just give people money, right? Karen says, give the poor more money and educate them with it. Yeah, so education is another sort of tangent of this as well. But again, education is something that can be limited for people in poverty as well. If you're not making enough money to feed and clothe and house yourself, you're not going to school, right? You're not paying tuition because you can't afford it. You can't go to school because you don't have enough time, because you're trying to work to cover your very basic needs, and still you're not even covering those basic needs. So often education gets tossed aside because people are, I'm sorry, this truck in the background. Often education gets tossed aside because people are just trying to survive, right? They're trying to work just hard enough to meet their needs, and even then they're not meeting it. Yeah, and this is a very common response to this, Casey. So the idea, yeah, it's hard to just give people money. Why don't we create jobs for them? Well, one of the things that we're probably moving towards in the West, but also globally. Go away, garbage truck. One of the things that we're moving toward is greater and greater automation, right? So we're going to see more machines, more robots, more algorithms, more computer programs take over jobs that used to be done by human beings. And so, but yet the number of human beings on the planet continues to rise. So the idea here, and some people are thinking about this, is that we're going to get to a point where a certain percentage of our population, there just won't be jobs for them, right? We don't need them to do anything because we've created computer algorithms and robots and things like that can do all of these things much better and much cheaper than humans ever could. So what's going to happen to those people that we just don't need to work? There's no jobs for them. We don't need them to do anything. What do? Do we create jobs for them? Do we just let them starve in the street because, sorry, there's not enough jobs? What do we do, right? So that's going to be a bit of an open question. And interestingly, it might be a question that you guys have to answer. It's not going to happen next week or next month, but in your working lives, there may come a time where societies have to decide, and maybe even global societies have to decide, because some countries are going to be more affected by this than others. But there might be a question of, what are we going to do when we have technology to meet all of our needs in society, but that means that 20% of society, there's no jobs for them. There's no meaningful work that they can do. We can't employ them. What do we do with those people? Do we pay them a universal basic income even though we don't need them to work? Or do we just let them starve? Or what do we do with them, right? And so, again, that's not a question that's been answered yet. That's not a place where we are yet. But that question is coming down the road toward us. And it's probably not a question that I'll have to answer. I hope they won't replace teachers with computer programs, although the fact that I'm doing this online means that I'm closer to a computer program than I've ever been. But hopefully that won't happen to me. But that's a question that you all may have to deal with in the future, is what do we do, right? What do we do with those collection of people that are no longer required to work, and we just do not have jobs for them? And it might be interesting to think about the fact that you may live in a world where not everyone needs to have a job. And so how are you going to conduct your working life in order to make sure that you still have a job if you want one? But again, those are questions that are down the road a little bit, but I think you all will live to see a time when that question needs to be answered. Okay. Erica says here, I think this solution is fine if the person can be responsible for the money given to them and can use it wisely. Yes, but Rutger is saying there's no strings attached. We're not going to watch how people spend this money. It's just money. But it will become unfair to the people who work hard. Yes, it might seem that way, but keep in mind we are, those of us who work are already paying the costs for poverty anyway, right? If child poverty in the US is costing $500 billion a year, I don't know how much it's costing in Canada. Let's say it costs $100 billion in Canada a year. I'm still paying for that, right? And as a working person, and that's not something I want to pay for. I don't want to pay so that children can be in poverty. That doesn't make me feel good. So if I'm going to carry the cost of this anyway as a taxpayer, I would rather something with better outcomes, right? Because it's going to cost money either way. And so, in some ways you might say it's unfair, but again, society tends to bear the cost of these things one way or another, unless you live in a totally heartless society and you just let people, starve to death on the roadside. But most of us don't live in that type of world, right? Eric says, and also, where will the government get the money from? Yeah, and so that's a good question. That's an excellent question. Um, Rutger might say that, well, the US manages to come up with hundreds of billions of dollars a year for military spending, right? So the money is there. The question is, how do we want to use our resources, right? So in Canada and the US, we have a, you know, we have a lot of money to spend every year that comes to us through taxation, right? The government taxes everything under the sun, and they get a lot of money, and then they spend that money every year in their budget. And so it's not so much a question of where the money comes from, but it's a question of how do we want our money to be spent. Clearly, the Americans want to spend a lot on their military. Um, and the Americans should ask themselves, is that really what they want? Is that a good use of their tax dollars? Maybe. Maybe for some, maybe not for others. But sometimes it's not so much a question of where the money comes from, but how do you want to spend it? And again, if poverty is already expensive and yet we have a bunch of negative outcomes, is this a better way, right? Do we spend less money or maybe even the same money, but do we get better outcomes? Do we get a better effect for the money that we spend? Because part of what Rutger is saying here is that poverty costs money anyway. The problem is that here, when you do universal basic income, you can clearly see how much it costs, right? You look at the price tag, you think, whoa, and you're sending money out the door to people and you think, whoa, there's the price tag. But when you don't do anything like that, there's still a price tag, but it's just much harder to see, right? The cost is invisible. It's worked into education and healthcare and policing and prisons and mental health facilities and drug treatment programs and disability pensions and welfare payments and social housing projects and all of these things the government is paying for, but you can't really tell how much of it is a result of poverty. And so the universal basic income has a very clear price tag. It's very easy to see how much it costs you. But when you just kind of let poverty go, it has an invisible price tag and people don't think it costs anything. But really, there's a very significant cost. It's just much more difficult to see. So I might challenge you to think about to think about how much money is actually going out the door, even though you can't quite see it. Whereas with universal basic income, you can very clearly see how much money is going out the door. Something to think about. Okay, that went on a little longer than I meant to, but that's okay because I know you had some good comments and I was happy to see those. Let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, I'll show you one more video and we'll talk about it. Okay, so take a break, come back in 10 minutes, and we'll talk about the next thing. Okay, and we're back. So I have another video to share with you now, and I think it might be interesting because it's connected to some of the things that Rutger was talking about. It's connected to some of the comments that have come up and the things that we were talking about before the break. And I think it might be pretty interesting for you. Before we get into it, there's just a couple of things that we need to know what they are in order to understand this talk, okay? And they are this. You may have heard of these economic measures before, but just in case you haven't, we'll need to know what they are in order to understand this talk. So the first one is something called gross national income. And so again, this is an economic measurement for a country, and it measures how much money on average the country makes. And so they take all the money earned and they divide it by how many people are in the country, okay? So it can either be a gross national income in terms of a dollar figure, or sometimes it's a gross national income per capita. And so per capita is per person. So you might see it one way or the other way, but again, you can, if you want to think about the gross national income in your own household, then add up the amount of money that everybody makes in your household and divide it by the number of people in your household, and then you have your gross national income. It's not a national income, it's a household income, but the gross income, and then if you divide it by the number of people, it's per capita, okay? Gross domestic product is a more common measure, and sometimes you'll hear politicians and people in the news talk about the GDP. And the GDP is kind of a measure of market activity in the country. And so they basically count up all the goods and services produced in a country, usually for a year. And then sometimes they'll have it in a dollar figure, but more often they'll have it in GDP per capita. Okay, so they'll take all the goods and services bought and sold in the country for a whole year. They'll divide it by how many people are in the country, and then they'll get a measure, right? And so most politicians and economists want the GDP to go up a little bit every year. And so often they're looking at fractions of a percent growth every year, and that's good. If you have your GDP going down, that's not a good sign, right? Your economy is starting to slow down, and politicians and economists start to get worried, right? So GDP is a very quick measure of how healthy your economy is and how much money is changing hands. Gross national income is how much people make, okay? And so just very quickly, here's gross national income per capita according to the World Bank for 2015. And so here you can see the countries that have the lowest gross national income are anywhere between $600 and $1,450 per year. So these are countries that are either very poor, well, they're probably very poor, but sometimes they are countries in which a lot of people just don't participate in the economy very much. So they might grow a lot of their own food, or they might trade for things that they need. And so their economic activity doesn't make it into the statistics. But as you can see, there are the numbers really range from $600 a year all the way to $140,000 a year on the top end. And so these are countries that either are the richest or they have people in them that are making a significant amount of money, right? So this is kind of the gross national income. And here's a measure of GDP. And so again, this has to do with economic activity in a country in the year. And so you can see the darker colors are countries with much more economic activity every year, and the lighter colored countries have less economic activity. And so again, that can mean that they're poorer countries. It usually does mean they're poorer countries, but it can also be that there are percentages of the population who aren't participating in the economy. So they're growing their own food, they're trading with other people, and so they're not, they're just not a part of the economy, and so their economic activity doesn't get measured. But either way, this is GDP and GNI, gross national income. Okay, so that's going to inform this TED Talk that we're going to watch here. And so I've actually added a question there, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to post it there. I just posted it in the student portal. And so what I'd like you to do is take 20 minutes, watch the talk. I think it's about 15 minutes long. Watch the talk. I've only got a few questions for you. I've only got 3 questions. Go watch the talk, listen to what Richard Wilkinson says, come back here in 20, and then we'll talk about it. I'm not going to say too much more because we're going to run out of time. So go watch the video, answer the questions. I'll see you in 20 minutes, okay? Have fun. Okay, and we're back. So, don't have a whole ton of time. There's a few things to unpack in this talk, but I think Richard Wilkinson's main point is pretty self-evident. He's got a lot of data to back it up, and so he shows us, graph after graph after graph. But I think he has a fairly direct point to make. And Casey says, to compare equal societies and see what inequality does. Yes. So he's looking at a bunch of rich market democracies, right? So we're not looking at poorer countries. We're not looking at countries with developing economies. We're looking at sort of rich democracies with market economies and with a developed kind of functioning economy. Those are the countries we're looking at. And so what does that inequality, not between societies, right? It's not that Portugal has more money than us, right? It's not about that. It's about what happens within a society, and when we have big differences in wealth and income within a given society. And so what happens? What do we see when we have a society with greater inequality, where there's a greater difference between the people at the bottom and the people at the top? What do we see? What do we see where in countries where we have more inequality, bigger differences between the people at the bottom and people at the top? So Karen says there is more social pressure and anxiety. Okay, that's true. That's true. Richard talks a little bit about social evaluative threat, right? And so he cites some psychological studies that show that the things that stress humans out the most are the things where their performance can be judged, or that they might be judged as people, as human beings, right? This is why nobody likes public speaking, right? Because you're standing up in front of large numbers of people, and those people are kind of judging you a little bit, right? And so it's one of the reasons why people really don't like public speaking, is because there's a very high social evaluative threat. It has the potential to really stress out a human being, right? There's a little more. What do we see? So when we have a society where we have greater income inequality, where there's a greater difference between the bottom end of society and the top end of society, what do we tend to see? Bah, that sounds like something a really like badass character in a movie would say, like when he's if he's been wronged by other people, and he like looks at the camera and he says, crimes will occur. That's that's what that sounds like to me. But you're partly right. You're partly right, Baha. That's true. Yeah, we have higher instances of mental illness. We have higher instances of crime. We have more anxiety. We have all kinds of different social problems, right? And that's what Richard is saying, right? He says that the greater your inequality within society, the more difference there is between the people at the top and the people at the bottom, the more social problems you have. And of course, he pulls out all kinds of different things to show us, right? He says, yeah, mental illness is higher, the percentage of the population that's in prison is higher, kids dropping out of school, teen pregnancy, obesity, life expectancy, educational outcomes, the degree to which people think they can trust other people. All of these things are affected, and in societies that are more equal, those things are less prevalent. Those social problems are less common. Societies with greater inequality, you have greater problems. And you probably, maybe you noticed when you looked at all those graphs, you saw that the US was always off in the top corner, right? It was way off the chart. And of course, if you look at the income inequality in the US, it is significantly more than in pretty much every other country that's part of that study. And so the US, we have the greatest inequality, economic inequality in society. And Richard Wilkinson says as a result, we have the greatest degree of social problems, social dysfunction. Okay, so we don't have a ton of time left. We have basically 2 minutes left here. Tomorrow's our last day. So come back tomorrow. We will wrap this classism thing up, and then I will try to do something that hopefully pulls this whole course together into an understandable ball. That might be a tall order for tomorrow, but I'm going to try to do it anyway. Yeah, so that's all I have. We'll pick up this Richard Wilkinson thing tomorrow and just kind of finish it up. We'll finish up classism. We'll try to summarize this last crazy 3 months worth of coursework in a short time, and then we'll pretty much be done. Yeah, so that's it. Those of you who participated in the live chat, of course, good work. Thank you for that. I always appreciate your comments because it makes me feel like I'm not in a room alone talking to myself like a crazy person. But other than that, some of you I'll see in comparative cultures in a few minutes. Some of you I'll see tomorrow. But yeah, that's it for now. So bye.